Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. Morson, professor in Slavic languages and literature at Northwestern University. And we're here today talking about his book, Wonder Confronts Certainty. Dr. Morson, wonderful to have you today.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
So normally I would start with, why did you write this book? But I think what I want to start with before even that is, what is a dialogue of the dead?
Oh, well, that's really a great question. It started out as a literary genre in the ancient world. And what would happen would be, the author would imagine that in Hades, people who had lived in different centuries could talk to each other. And finally, what happened if Alexander the Great, could meet Heraclitus, if, Julius Caesar could meet Alexander the Great, what would they say to each other, right? And so it was a way of posing, usually it was philosophers, and it was a way of getting them to imagine pinning each other down so they could get the full logical impact of their ideas. And it was not just that, you got them to do that even though they never met in life. It was that, if you're dead, you don't have to worry about the consequences of your actions. And so they were much freer to talk than anybody was in life, right? So this became a dialogue which, a literary genre, which continued, it continues right up to the present. People are still writing, and you can see its appeal. But I decided that that's how I would imagine the Russian conversation. I did literally sort of imagine Hades, but I tried to, not do history, that is one after the other, but explain how they pose the ultimate questions of life, and then imagine they could all be part of the same conversation, talking with each other. So, the Russians have a very strong sense of their tradition. So, in fact, they're doing that anyway. Sometimes when you hear, Solzhenitsyn talk about Tolstoy, it's almost as if, they were present and he was annoyed by him personally. So it didn't take that much work to do this, but that was the way I wanted to do it, because I wasn't so much interested, there is some history in the book, but I wasn't so much interested in, how things developed the way a historian would, but what the Russian experience of asking ultimate questions could teach us, right? So, and my idea was that their questions, just as they thought they were the eternally relevant questions that people are always going to ask, will always be there. And so, to say we're really good at asking them, we could learn something from it. And that's, how I think about literature. I think about literature for me, there are other ways to think about literature, but I've always thought of it as a source of wisdom, right? A source of wisdom in the sense that you don't get from other disciplines. There's overlap, of course, but, when a great novelist poses philosophical questions, he doesn't do it the way, let's say, an analytic philosopher would do it. And the same kinds of arguments or evidence don't work for one as work for the other. So, I don't know. The typical way, let's say, a philosophical novel works, the ones like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, they were written in England too, is you explore first, you get the character who has a certain set of beliefs. And first you explore what makes those beliefs convincing to him or her, right? That is, people always think it's because they're logically cogent and fitly evident, but there's usually strong emotional reasons, or personal reasons. And so you kind of you cast a little bit of irony on the beliefs. The world is not as simple as you think, and you don't believe it all the reasons that you think you do. And then the plot of the novel then it explores what happens if you actually try to live these beliefs, which are always simpler than real life and real experience, in a real world, and what consequences does it actually lead to? And the result is that, the beliefs always turn out to be too simple and flawed. And that's what makes novels, really, realist novels different from other literary genres, right? Like, there's a literary genre called the utopia, about you journey to the perfect socialist future, and you get all. In that case, the philosophical ideas are not too simple. They are the truth. And anybody who thinks that the world is complex is simply trying to mystify you so you don't see the simple truth. It's the exact opposite philosophical premise, right? But the great realist novels are always showing how the world is too complex and there's something you've forgotten. You were right to ask the question, but there's something you've forgotten by being too certain. And that's sort of part of the title, about certainty. Those who are certain they have the answer. Usually ideologues did, the communist philosophers did, the 19th century revolutionaries of many different beliefs did. But the great writers cultivated a spirit of wonder. That is, the world is so complex we will never fully understand it. We can, by keep asking the questions, we will never get final answers, but we will deepen our understanding with each step.
That's actually, I might just steal this entire clip from you and just use it as a promo for the show, because that's the idea is from Job, that the Leviathan is something that you cannot catch. So the idea of chasing Leviathan is we're chasing the truth, but we can't ever catch it. And that's literally what you're talking about here.
That's why you have the title here.
Yes, yes. So I really resonate with that. That's really awesome. Even as you're talking about the different genres as sources of wisdom, I've been reading kind of classics to my kids, and so I've gone with fables and fairy tales, which Aesop's and Grimm's feel like they should be similar, but they're actually quite distinct, right? And they're both sources of wisdom, I think, in many ways, but they're very even different from the novel. I'm reading, of course, they're growing up and everyone's telling them you need to be fair and these sorts of things. And we read Aesop's fable, and I can't remember which animal it was. There's one animal that's stronger than the other, and they do a task together. I think it's the wolf and the fox. And at the end, the the wolf's like, actually, I know this is supposed to be our reward together, but I'm just going to take it all. And the fox is like, that's not fair. And he's like, I don't care. And it's like, might makes right. And that's the end of the, and my kids look at each other and they look at me and they're like, that's not supposed to happen. And I'm like, but you know what? It does. It's like, and that's a totally different, very similar to kind of this utopian novels where it's like, there's a right way to do things and we will end up with this ideal. And then you have this fable that's just like, no, sometimes the wolf just takes everything, even just because he's a jerk and he can.
Well, yeah, and it sort of teaches, kids that justice is one thing and the agreements that you make with people are something else. Right?
Yes,
you can't just rely on justice to enforce them.
And it's funny because it seems super simple, but when you actually start breaking that down, it is quite complex, and it is something that literature provides, right?
Right.
So you mentioned a little bit about wonder confronts certainty. Where did you get? How did that title come to you, and who are some of the main players in your Dialogue of the Dead? You've already mentioned some of them, but
okay. Well, how the title came to me, I was, reading this book. I don't know, written by a Russian literature professor a generation before me, and on what he called the positive hero in Russian literature. That is, the perfect virtuous hero. Socialist realist literature, communism is filled with it, right? And he was talking about that worldview and, what happens when, someone sees things differently. And right in the middle of a paragraph, he had the phrase, "Wonder confronts certainty." And I thought, this is the title I've been looking for, for 10 years. So that's why, he's credited immediately. You open the book, the quotations from him. I wish he had not been dead for 40 years so we could see it. So his students are still around, and they appreciate it.
Yes, yes.
I was not his student. And then you asked, who are the writers? Well, here's the way I basically set it up. This is a little too simple, but it's basically correct. There are two broad traditions of argument in Russia. And one are the people who are certain, and one of the people who are not, right? And the people who are certain were the members of what was called the intelligentsia. Now, intelligentsia is a word we get from Russian. It was coined there about 1860. But it doesn't mean in Russian, or it didn't mean in Russian, what it means here. If by, it doesn't mean an intellectual. Right?
Huh. Okay. I was not expecting that.
It's almost the exact opposite. Okay. If by an intellectual you mean someone who thinks for himself, it emphatically does not mean that. It means an ideologue who was signed on to the program, the received program of whatever radical school you belong to. Okay? You are not, skepticism is ruled out. Okay? You have the truth. Now, it was really interesting how this group developed, and other societies, sometimes have these, but not all. To be a member of the intelligentsia, there were, you couldn't just, being educated didn't do it. Okay. For example, if you were not an atheist, some sort of socialist or anarchist, definitely a revolutionary, you couldn't be a member of the intelligentsia. If you didn't believe that the only function of art was propaganda, you couldn't be a member of the intelligentsia. Then you had to sort of sever, it's almost like a monk, you had to sever all your ties with the rest of society and identify not as a nobleman or a member of this or that ethnic group, but as a member of the intelligentsia. That had to be your identity. And so that was a group. They became the terrorists and revolutionaries and the radical journalists. And as you can imagine, that was contrary to everything that made great art. I mean, you can't make great art if we're going to illustrate a narrow program we already know, right? So, people like Chekhov had utter contempt for these people. Tolstoy did. Dostoevsky not only had contempt, but he thought them extremely dangerous. He didn't have contempt because he didn't look down on them. He thought they were really dangerous. And the only one in the 19th century anywhere who foresaw what totalitarianism would be. That didn't exist. You had to be a genius. But he, asked, what if these people actually do gain power? What will they do? And in one of his novels, he actually describes in detail what would happen. And what he describes actually predicts, the only thing it does, if it's not in Soviet totalitarianism, it was in Chinese. The Cultural Revolution is described in detail, right? Or in Cambodia. And it's all there. He knew this, right? So you get these two rival traditions, right? There was a critic writing in 1909 who, I love the quotation, so I used it. He said, "The surest gauge of the greatness of a Russian writer is the extent of his hatred for the intelligentsia." Now, of course, that doesn't mean intelligentsia in our sense, but in their sense, right? So, if you think of the history of the Russian tradition as, let's say, Lenin on one side and Tolstoy on the other, right? 19th century terrorists, Russia invented modern terrorism, right? On one side, and Tolstoy, or Chekhov, or Dostoevsky on the other. Now, what happens, you see, in 1917 is that one faction of the radical intelligentsia, the Bolsheviks, take over. And from that point on, the writers are not just facing another social group, they are facing a government which is trying to put that program into effect. And so there, you get, all these wonderful writers who are not official writers. They have to oppose official writers, right? And so that becomes this tradition. That's how, when you get, Solzhenitsyn and Pasternak. And since the government was absolutely militant, the first principle of Bolshevism was atheism and materialism. If you believed that there was any spiritual or higher value, if you believed in a phrase that you would speak with contempt, the sanctity of human life, that proved you were a believer in God. Because where would the sanctity of human life come from? You're just matter, right?
Yeah.
The idea that something having higher value could only come from religion, or maybe Kantian philosophy, which was religion in disguise. Okay? So if you actually believed that human life was worth preserving for its own sake, you were clearly an enemy. You were religious, right? So you said that the atheism was so it's not really surprising that if you think about it, this is the first really officially atheist state that took it really seriously and lasted. And several of the greatest writers were Christians, right? They were Boris Pasternak, right? And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, right? And Mikhail Bulgakov. And the ones who were not Christian, like, the Jewish Grossman, he still believed in similar higher values that were completely opposed, right? So he sort of fits in the same camp, although he's not quite a Christian, right? He believes in, the ultimate values that Christians pretty much believe in. So it's an amazing phenomenon, right? It only struck me, while writing this book, how odd it was. I always knew that the great writers were all dissidents, but that so many of them were Christian had never occurred to me, until I was actually working on them. And that's really significant because, it's the opposite, right, of what the regime was. If you're living in a society where they really take seriously the idea that people are nothing but matter, that's it, right?
Yeah.
Really takes materialism to an extreme that American materialists haven't dreamed of, right? You begin to see why there's either that or you believe in something transcendent. God, maybe it's a Buddhist truth or Taoist, but it can't just be matter, okay? It can't just be matter, right? And that's why you get so many, people experiencing some sort of religious conversion. And there really is, even the ones who don't, like, there are memoirs of people, in the Gulag who remain communists and atheists, but even though they'd been arrested, right? But they acknowledged that the only people who you could trust not to turn you in order to survive, steal your food or get right, were the believers. And these were atheists saying, and the only people who had the courage to stand up for their convictions, even at the cost of their life, believers. And it didn't seem to matter what religion it was. There were Pentecostalists and Baptists, and of course Russian Orthodox, and Jews and Muslims. It didn't seem to matter, but they believed in something, that these atheists thought was crazy. But they had to acknowledge that it gave them a moral fiber that the atheists didn't have. So that's really strange too, right?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit? I mean, you mentioned Dostoevsky, and you mentioned kind of that you see literature as this, won't say alternative, one of the sources of wisdom that gets passed down through a culture. Can you expound on that a little bit? Even like you talk about the genius that Dostoevsky had to look ahead. And how does that translate into wisdom? How do you see that wisdom in and through literature? Like, what does that do?
Well, let me just narrow literature down to realist novels for the moment. The way realist novels work, they're great innovation. I always think of it as, the real inventor of this was Jane Austen, who first use this as a consistent device throughout a novel. And there's a kind of language that they use which gets you inside the head of another person, allows you not just to see what they do, but to co-experience their sequence of thoughts from within. One form of this, but not the most interesting, is stream of consciousness. There are others which are much more interesting. If we have time, I describe it. But the whole point is that when you read, let's say, 800 pages about Anna Karenina, you have not just seen what she's done, but you have traced the sequence of her emotions. You wince, no, Dana, don't do that, right? Because you're living within her, right? That is, what you experience is intellectual and emotional empathy for hundreds and hundreds of days with people who are very different from you, who have different beliefs, maybe a different gender, certainly a different social class and nationality, right? But you learn, not as an abstract principle, you need to empathize, but actually what it feels like to empathize. And you get practice in it, because you do it for hundreds of pages. And it teaches you to see the world differently from the way you otherwise would. Because we see from one set of eyes, but now you're practicing from another set of eyes, right? Only the great realist novels teach empathy in that way. And that is one of the reasons why, I think literature is so important in, to read and in college education, because there is nothing else that gives you practice in empathy. And nowadays, I'm not talking about emotional empathy, but nowadays, more often than not, you're not, just as in the Soviet Union, you're not supposed to empathize with wrong ideas, just our ideas. That doesn't require empathy, of course, right? Agreeing with yourself requires no effort.
Yeah.
But novels get you to do that. Right? They're, in that sense, always subversive, right? Not in the sense, politically revolutionary, but in the sense that they subvert your habits of thought. Right? They get you to see the world. They get you, even though you imagine that all truth is on one side, they get you to know why a decent, honorable person with different experience, because none of us have all of our experiences partial, might see things differently and think differently. You learn, historians, for example, will tell you that to really understand another century or another culture, you need not just to project your values onto it, how you would behave and what you would anticipate, but how they did it. Otherwise, you don't understand what's going on, right? If you just think of, let's say, Isaac Newton, the great, as someone who thinks like modern scientists, but back then, you don't understand. Then why did he spend most of his time doing alchemy?
Right.
Writing interpretations of the book of Daniel, the book of the Apocalypse. Something very different was going on, right? Of which that led to what we think was great scientific discoveries. But he didn't think they were his most important thing. What produced that? You see, how does a 3rd century, Chinese thinker pose questions that we pose, but in a different frame? That's what historians will tell you need to learn. But literature actually gives you constant practice in doing, right? The Russians are really good. It's a great realist novel, and they combine it with asking philosophical questions, so you not only get the emotion, but you actually get what it is to think philosophically. And it's strange. Even, the way they do it, characters you don't think of as philosophers still have a worldview which is really philosophical, like Anna Karenina does. Oh, she's not a philosopher. She really has a sense of it, and she articulates it within, just not in a systematic way, but it's there, right?
Right,
and
right.
You can see it. You can see what the assumptions are by what she said, what she finds convincing somebody else, and you begin to see what that world is. And, you begin to see, for example, how a sequence of ideas, could lead you to suicide. The wrong ideas, which happens in a lot of Russia.
Yeah, yes, a little kind of infamous for that. It's interesting. There's for as long as I've been part of education, there's been a big call for critical thinking and installing critical thinking. And one of the things that's always been interesting to me is that any curriculum I see with that, generally, that I've been exposed to at least, is very narrow and is often very rhetorical in focus or writing in focus. But if you go into, the German idealist tradition, and even what you're talking about here, there's this idea of education that's meant to broaden our minds, and I don't hear that talked about much. But that's, I think, another way of. I want to make sure I'm tracking with you here. That to me also sounds like another way of talking about this empathy. That education's not just to form us for a specific spot, but it's supposed to broaden our minds so that we are better humans. And some of that is we talk about critical thinking. Is it's not just about a set of rules to follow or a set of best practices. It's also being acquainted with different grounds for conversation, different grounds for dialogue. And I think that's a lot of times we're trained in a very specific tradition. And what happens is when we're acquainted and when we deal with different traditions, like the great Russian authors, or even reading a Chinese author from the 3rd century. Yeah, we have to adapt our ideas to an entirely different cultural ground, and it requires us to do a different form of almost creative thinking. Is that match with what you're saying?
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying. And you mentioned critical thinking. It sounds wonderful, critical thinking, but what it actually means in practice is believe what I do and criticize the thinking of somebody else. That's what it means actually in practice, which is the exact opposite of what you might think the phrase critical thinking, right? Similarly, I was, when I first came to Northwestern University, this was 35 years ago, I was walking down the corridor and I saw that there was this other professor who had, on her door, a big sign that said, "Question authority," right? And one day I was walking past and I heard her from within saying to a poor student, "Haven't you learned anything from my class?" Question somebody else's authority is what you mean, not mine, right?
Right.
That's how critical thinking. So that's not how realist novels, right?
Mm.
They really are trying to teach you to get out of your, you will find Dostoevsky certainly had very strong political and philosophical views, but you will find in some of his novels characters who hold those views appearing completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right?
A certain form of self-awareness.
Yeah. Right? And that's, kind of, let's say you pick up a realist, say something like George Eliot or any of the great realist novels, and, the narrator comments, or the author is talking. It's not like A Saint's Life, where what the author says is the truth. The author presents her view as, this is what I believe. But my view is one view among many. I know I don't have the absolute, but it's what I believe. So that's a very different stance from, let's say, what a Bolshevik author was supposed to do, is because Marxism, Leninism was, period, the absolute truth that would never change. That's why it was, considered far above physics, because physics is going to change, but Marxism, Leninism won't. So at very often, points in Soviet history, a scientific doctrine, whether in biology, chemistry, or physics, would come in conflict with the philosophy of Marxism, Leninism, and it was always the physics or the biology that had to go. So genetics was rejected for a while. Various theories of chemistry, relativity theory was rejected for a while.
I did not know that. That's
there's this wonderful story, that the physicist Andrei Sakharov, later dissident, right, prominent liberal dissident, who was famous for having invented the Soviet hydrogen bomb, right? And he tells the story of how Stalin comes to him once to talk, and he said, I've been reading this new physics. Stalin, by the way, was a real intellectual. I know he's just a thug, but he was not. He was brutal, but he was not uneducated. Right? And he's talking to Sakharov, and I've been reading about this new physics, and he's talking about quantum physics, and notions like indeterminacy and uncertainty, which are completely contrary to the Marxist-Leninist idea that everything can be known absolutely certain. To think you can, that's the equivalent of its Gnosticism. We're atheists, not agnostic. So he says, so isn't this contrary to Marxism-Leninism? And Sakharov reports that he replied, well, you know, I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a physicist. I don't know if it's contrary, he said, but I do know you can't make a hydrogen bomb without it. Go ahead, sister.
Yeah, right. Oh, man.
It's a wonderful story. You know?
Yes. Right. Like, it's those little contradictions and instabilities that are drawn out by novelists, right? It's like, well, I really disagree with this, and I am certain about my disagreement, but also I need the hydrogen bomb if I'm going to remain in power, right?
Well, you know, there's this wonderful novel by Vasily Grossman, I don't know if you know, called Life and Fate. Some people think it's the great novel of the 20th century. I don't think it's the great, but I think it's very good. Its hero is a physicist, you know, who, you know, has to come in conflict with various, you know, official ideas. And there are so many very interesting characters who are devoted communists and how they think, right? And you get a whole panoply of views of, you know, on different ways of having wonder or certainty, right? And it's quite beautifully done. But he makes sure to make the hero a physicist because he has to interact with notions that, well, I'm sorry, this is not Marxist. This is the period when everything bad was thought to be Jewish. This is Talmudic, not real Marxist. You know, in other periods there are other reasons, right? But he has to confront all of this, right? And it's, you know, it's really quite beautifully done. The hero was actually based on a real physicist. But,
oh, who is the real physicist?
Oh, I'm trying to remember his name now.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Yeah,
I remember. I could look it up for you. I think it's had the same last name, Strom, something like that. I could look it up.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. I did want to ask you about you go through the three types of thinkers. Do you mind kind of exploring that for us?
Sure. Now, this is when I'm dealing with the pre-revolutionary period. And I'm trying to give a portrait of, so you don't just think these are abstract, you know, ideas that are walking around with bodies attached, but real people. I talk about three types of Russian thinkers, what their personalities were like and how they thought. Three broad types that constantly were recurred, you know, that repeated over and over again, that are described in memoirs and fiction, you know, and everyone recognizes it. I call the first one the wanderer, and that was a type that, you know, if you were uneducated, you were the type that we were pilgrim. There were a lot of people who did this. You know, in the Middle Ages, they were in Western Europe. People would go from shrine to shrine. That was going on in Russia in the 19th century. And there were a lot of them who were looking for some sort of, in Russia, of course, ultimate truth. Right? But if you were intellectual, you didn't go from shrine to shrine. You went from philosophy to philosophy, each one promising to answer all the questions of existence. And what a wanderer would do, there are Chekhov stories describing such people, is they would be absolutely certain of one philosophy, and then they would be disillusioned. Now, what they never did was think, oh, maybe the truth is not in a single philosophy. Maybe the world is too complex. No, they just leap to another philosophy.
Right.
There's never a moment of skepticism. There's a moment of disillusionment, but never skepticism, and disillusionment lasts only until you get into the philosophy, which isn't very long. Okay? So this time, some of the real people, I give portraits of them, they're amazingly interesting people, sometimes absolutely brilliant. You know, Russia's greatest literary critic was one of those. He was constantly going from ideology to ideology. And he was quite self-aware. I mean, one of my favorite lines is when he says, you know, if I had the power, it would go really badly with someone who thought the way I did 6 months ago. Okay? It never leads to skepticism or humility, right? Right? So that's one type of thinker. And there's another type of thinker who I call, you know, the idealist. And these are different because there are two types of these, but what they all do is they don't go from idea to idea. They just cling to one idea forever. So the model for them that was always used was Don Quixote, right? Turgenev was an essay. So, and, no matter what the disillusionment is, it's be like, evil magicians made it look that way, just the way Don Quixote, except it's not evil magicians, it's, right? They would cling to the idea. And the other guy was one who also could have only one idea, but would face disillusion and had to confront. And those were, the most common type of those were the populists, who in this, another term we get from Russia, they were, they believed that all virtue lay with the simple Russians, the peasants. And so there were all these philosophies based on it. And they would go to the countryside and they would find that they were cruel, brutal, drunken, do terrible things to each other. Not only not support widows and orphans, but kill them or take advantage. I mean, it was awful. Absolutely what they actually found. They, as one of them said, I saw nothing but swinishness. And then he tries at one point to, well, listen, if if the peasants are all good and this is what the peasants do, maybe that's what true morality is. So he adopts swinishness. I mean, he does everything. Nothing works, right? And he has wonderful stories, this guy, clearly autobiographical. But to give it short, he went mad. And he wound up thinking that he was a pig. That is all this swinishness. He took it literally and became a pig in his own mind. A lot of these populists went mad. Okay? Some of them were brilliant writers. Okay? And again, Chekhov has a story about one of them. Some of them committed suicide. Others became alcoholics. So that's the second type, the ideal.
Yeah.
And the third type is what I call the revolutionist. Now, a revolutionist is not just a revolutionary. A revolutionist is someone who loves revolution or terrorism for their own sake. The thrill of it. Right? The sense that you are beyond good and evil. That you can, kill. You can do anything. That you are a god. Right? That the intensity that comes from, you could be killed any minute during a terrorist, attack. The thrill of your life on the line. There are a lot of these, some of them with different motives. But the point was that you were a revolutionary for your own sake. This is for people who created the modern terrorist movement in Russia. Russia is the first country where, if you ask a young man or woman, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? They might say terrorist. It was a respectable occupation, sometimes passed on from generation to generation. The whole families were terrorists from generation. The Lenins were one of them, right? Not by no means the only. Well, Lenin's siblings were terrorists, revolutionaries. There were a lot of these families. And, of course, it was a very dangerous occupation. May not live long, but it was a highly respectable. The only one occupation that, had more respect, or as much respect in Russia, was writer. Because, Russians adore literature. It's the purpose of existence, is literature. So I discovered while doing my work that there was this one terrorist, the most famous terrorist of his day, killed a lot of prominent people, named Boris Savinto. And he was also a novelist. And he wrote novels about terrorism, right? And one of them has since been translated, most of them have not. But I realized reading, his memoirs and his novels and all about him, I couldn't tell whether he wrote novels to dramatize his terrorist activities or he became a terrorist to have material for novels. He kept clippings of both his activities, his reviews of his books and his reviews of his terrorism. He got them together. So this is the other type. He would do for any. He didn't care what the philosophy was. This kind of populism, this kind of socialism. He'd be a terrorist for anybody. Right? It didn't matter. Right? Terrorism was a goal. You start with the welfare of the people is the goal, so revolution is the means. Then revolution becomes the goal, right, in itself, and terrorism becomes the means, and then terrorism becomes the goal, right, a goal in itself. It keeps going like that, right? So those have become the three types that they appear over and over in literature, and the writers are fascinated with these types. They see them around them all the time. And, what is very often the case in Russia is that people you think with very dangerous, crazy, cruel ideas are geniuses who are highly creative, highly creative thinkers. That goes right up to the present, by the way.
Even as you're talking here, absolutely fascinating. I didn't realize that terrorism had been invented in this way in Russia.
Well, there have been earlier terrorists, but this is has a movement of this sort. With, not just a few terrorists over here, but a whole.
Can you contextualize that for me a little bit? Because I'm trying to I'm you're talking about they're killing people. They're doing it for the sake of a movement. Can you give us maybe some stories about what that would look like? Because I'm trying to picture in my head a little bit more concretely what you're talking about when you say terrorist.
Well, it starts out in a relatively simple way. What you want to do is kill prominent government officials. And in the 1870s, you have this group of people who would, they developed ways of stalking them and eventually, throwing bombs and killing them. And their goal was eventually to kill the Tsar. And they did in 1881. They blew him off with a bomb. It was like their 15th try, and why, the government was so incompetent not to, catch them. I mean, there was one time that they decided they were going to kill him by blowing up the entire palace that he was in, and everybody in it at the same time, and kill him along with it. And, so the way they did it was that police were checking anyone who went to the building, but not the tradesmen who were working in the basement. Well, the guy came in as a tradesman, and every day he brought in a little bit of explosive, right? One day, he lit it, and he blew up the whole ballrooms were destroyed, and everybody in them, right? I mean, children were killed. The Tsar's children were thrown, far away. They weren't killed, but they were hurt. But the Tsar happened to have just stepped out for a minute, so he wasn't killed. Lots of other people were, right? But they finally...
Good.
Then in the 90s, in the beginning of the 20th century, it became a mass movement. It wasn't just a few, it was thousands of people, right? They who would do things like throw bombs laced with nails into cafes to see how the foul bourgeois will squirm, as one of them put it, right? I mean, anyone who could be identified as having a connection to the government, even a post office clerk, would either be bombed or be another thing they love to do is throw sulfuric acid in their face. You're going to see somebody after that, and they look.
No.
Right? And it was one of my favorite. There were more terrorist attacks than traffic accidents. And one of my favorite stories is a provincial newspaper where one of the reporters asked the editor, new governor has just been appointed. Shall we run his biography? And the answer is no, save it for the obituary.
Yeah.
It's not going to be very long.
Right.
So this is what the culture of terrorism was like at the beginning of the 20th century. That's what, it was extraordinary. There's never been anything like that. And now, when the Bolsheviks took over, the terrorists, including the ones who were not Bolsheviks but belonged to other ideologies, Lenin was shooting everybody who didn't belong to, to his party. The socialist, the liberal. But the terrorists found employment with him working for the Cheka, the secret police. He hired them. They knew what they were doing. They wouldn't be squeamish. So a lot of them found employment. Well, who do they care who they're killing? It's just terrorism. Right?
And that's, I think I was struggling, and it's become clear as you're talking about what's the difference between like a terrorist and an assassin, right? Is this the emotional effect, and even like you've mentioned a little bit of this emphasis on the media, and is that part of the outgrowth of some of the technology like spreading like the press?
Yeah, it is. I mean, assassins typically, they've existed for a long time. The point is simply you are the target is a particular person, and you want to get rid of that person. The story, about how the word assassin comes is, it's a medieval word, Muslim word, derived from hashish, because to get these people to go and risk their lives, they would be hashishans or assassins. Right? They existed for a long time, but a terrorist is trying to frighten not just kill a single person, but frighten all of society. You blow up a whole palace to kill your god, right? You throw bombs into cafes. That's the assassin as terrorist, right?
Right. Or the sulfuric acid, which is not it's more about the fear and the disfigurement than the death.
Right.
Wow.
And you didn't have to really do anything to get that sort of treatment, right? In fact, they supported themselves by robberies. They called them expropriations to make it sound. But there were so many of these expropriations that the criminal gangs started claiming that they were not stealing, they were doing expropriations. So it was very hard to tell who were the revolutionaries engaged in robbery and who were the robbers. And in fact, sometimes they were the same person. A guy, okay, I'll give this much to the party and take this much for myself. It's a fascinating, there's a wonderful book about this written about 20 years ago by a historian called Thou Shalt Kill, about Russian revolutionary terrorism in this period. It's a wonderful book. It's absolutely riveting. But then, starting with that, I read their memoirs, their novels, and they wrote them. Savage was not the only terrorist who wrote novels or memoirs. This is Russia, right? Where you have to.
That's what you do, right? I want to be respectful of your time, but I did want to especially ask, as you talk about timeless questions, one of the first that you mentioned, and I think is just really on point for what we've talked about today, is what can't theory account for?
Yeah, the third part of the book was about half of it. It's been set up before, by what people were like and all that. The big questions that I talked about, and then I go through how they argued about them. So one of them is that the constantly argue, what is the role of theory in life? Is theory like hard science? Can it be a hard social science?
Right.
Question which is very much with us, right? That determines everything in life with laws of physics. And this theory, therefore, take precedence over specific events. If you're a physicist, you're not interested in a particular event. You're interested in the laws governing it, right? And, the same with if you're a social scientist, the people conform to the laws if you've really got a science. Or can it be, this is what, Leo Tolstoy argued, he gave, and Dostoevsky too, why there could never be a social science. It's not that we don't have one yet. Never. And this is amazing. You think about the number of people who from the 17th century, in our time, not just Marx, but Freud thought he had a hard science. And, more recently, Jared Diamond thinks he has a hard science. And there are a lot of economists who think that economics is a hard science. It's a dream, just what Newton did for the planets, we can do. And the Russians, there are a lot of Russians like that, but there are also a lot who are like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky who give very principled reasons why, let's say, contingency is absolutely ineradicable, or other reasons why, human beings will never be subject to it. I mean, in Tolstoy's novel War and Peace, he does it by having the generals, who are the Russian generals there, all believe they have a social science, a science of warfare. And Tolstoy makes it clear he means to refer to any possible social. And they all plan battles, and they say, every contingency has been foreseen. We can plan them down scientifically. And they lose.
Right.
They lose. And then do they say, oh, well, maybe we don't have a science. No. And he gives all the excuses that people always give. I don't know. You make a prediction about what the temperature in the earth is going to be in a certain time, and it turns out to be wrong. I mean, do you say, yeah, well, we basically are right in our picture, but we need a little more work on, on the particulars. No, you just ignore it or you explain it away, right? And the same with economists, well, yeah, no, I mean, we didn't predict that recession, true, but now we've modified the theory so we could have predicted. You always excuse, you want to say, listen, any cockamamie theory can predict the past. The test is whether you predict the future, right? But that people don't, because the dream is so strong that knowledge to be real has to resemble physics or mathematics. But real humanistic knowledge, real knowledge of society, is not at all like that. It involves wisdom, not hard science. Aristotle was very clear about this. There are two types of knowledge, right? Ethics, for example, he says, is not a matter of, but does not resemble mathematics, because there's always an exception. There's always something that doesn't quite fit. The contingencies can't be foreseen. That's why you need wisdom. And he says, this is why young people very often become fabulous mathematicians, but they never become good at ethics. Because it relies on a lot of experience and being wrong a lot and reflecting on it. And of course, old people usually don't do that either, but they could do it. And so, right, the only people who could be good at ethics are old people who've had the experience and reflected properly on it. Right? But that's not true with mathematics or physics, right?
Right.
And so you have the sense of two kinds of knowledge, right? And one of them, again, is about you can't be certain. One of Aristotle's favorite phrases, on the whole and for the most part, right? Which, mathematicians don't speak of, on the whole, for the most part, the angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees. Right? You wouldn't understand mathematics if you did that, if you said something like that. Right? But, the Russian novelists are in a world of, on the whole, and for the most part.
One, let me say, first of all, I have really enjoyed this conversation. If, as our audience goes out for this week, and this is often one of my most frustrating questions, I know that. But what is one takeaway that you could give them to just think about through the week from our discussion today?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, if you think about ethical questions, how certain can you be of the answer? I have a whole couple of chapters on ethics in the book, and the way we think about them. How certain can you be of the answers? What are the dangers of being too certain? And how can you learn from getting inside the head and soul of someone who sees differently? What's the benefit of thinking, maybe sometimes people disagree with me, not because they're evil, but because their experience has been different. And maybe I can learn. I might not change my mind, but maybe I can learn something, right? Deepen my mind, even if not change it, right? What's the advantage of doing that? And is there actually an ethical imperative to do that when you're dealing with ethics or anything else, right? That's sort of, that's a key question. And just raising the question about how far, when, you do this, it is, I think, one of the great lessons that literature has to teach.
Dr. Morson, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on today. Thank you.
Oh, it's been a pleasure being here. You asked great questions. Thank you so much.